Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here for the opening of this exhibition. It's great to see it in its new location, and I feel very familiar with all these objects, and it's great to see them here. So the exhibition, The First Emperor, China's Terracotta Army, which opens this week at the High, takes a new look at a very important archaeological site in China. It's the tomb site of China's first emperor. And it looks at his ambitions and his achievements. And the aim of the exhibition, which was first seen at the British Museum, which opened in 2007 in September, is to present a reassessment of one of the best known finds in world archaeology, the Terracotta Army. And this Terracotta Army belonged to the first emperor of China. Here you can see rows of warriors lined up in pit number 1. And these are guarding the tomb of the first emperor of China. Millions of visitors have marveled at this site in the on-site museum, which opened in 1979. It's evidence of the organizational power of the first emperor of China, whose name was Qin Shihuangdi. It's quite a long and difficult name to pronounce, but he unified China in 221 BC. But this terracotta army has also become a symbol of China's long and coherent cultural history. And now that China's developing so rapidly, it reminds the world of China's future potential as well. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the exhibition and how it was put together at the British Museum, and a bit about the first emperor and his tomb site, and the significance of the first emperor. The exhibition was conceived in September 2005, when I accompanied Neil MacGregor, the British Museum's director, on his first visit to Xi'an. And here you can see him on the left and me on the right in the storage rooms of the Terracotta Army Museum in Xi'an. And we're inspecting a kneeling archer. And when you go into the exhibition, you'll be able to see a kneeling archer just like this right at the beginning. We felt that while Qin Shihuangdi's Terracotta Army may be well known to many people, the ongoing excavation work at his tomb site, which is still going on these days, and the significance of the first emperor's achievements in unifying China were not known by the general public in the Western world. Of course, we learn a lot about Western history, about the history of the ancient Western world, but we don't learn so much in our schools about the history of ancient China. And at a time when China is developing so quickly and occupying a high profile throughout the world, economically and politically, it seemed to us appropriate to present an exhibition which would educate new generations about the man responsible for creating a unified China. So, with sponsorship secured, planning for the exhibition continued during 2006. And here is a slide of me with Caroline Ingham, who's our senior designer at the British Museum. And I made a trip with her, and we went on a trip all around Shanxi province, because Xi'an, the capital of Shanxi province, is near where the first emperor's tomb is. But a lot of the things in the exhibition, well, some of the things in the earlier part of the exhibition come from the earlier capitals of the Qin state. So we had to go all round Shanxi province looking for objects to select for the exhibition. And there was an awful lot of eating and drinking and toasting and negotiating. And I think I probably put on at least £7 in the process, because every time you go to borrow any object, you have to have a meal. And it's a big meal. And Hiromi Kinoshita, who's here today, was appointed as assistant exhibition curator. And she subsequently made more trips to finalize details of the list and to accompany photographers. And I made one more trip with Neil McGregor to sign a letter of intent with the Chinese authorities. It was not easy, the negotiations for how many of this and how many of that we were allowed to have. And a lot of the objects in the exhibition are called Grade 1 objects, and the Chinese Antiquities Service has a system of grading the objects. So they're Grade 1, Grade 2, Grade 3, or ordinary. And nearly all of all the Terracotta Army is Grade 1, and a lot of the objects were Grade 1, and we really we exceeded our allocation of Grade 1 objects, so there was quite a lot of negotiation. And in fact, it had to go right up to the level of the State Council to get this exhibition list approved. And also, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, decided to make a documentary about the making of the exhibition, and this was presented by a rising TV history star who's called Dan Snow, and here you can see him on the right here. He's very tall and young, and he's becoming quite popular in England with these popular TV history shows. And so that meant that Hiromi and I went with the BBC crew and Dan on a filming trip in March 2007 and took a group of UK press. And the film, which was made, was shown on BBC TV in September 2007, around the time of the opening, and it received 4 million viewers. And this also meant that many of the stages of the preparation of the list and the catalogue and the exhibition design were filmed as they happened. We chose authors for the catalogue to include leading figures in the field and new research and new finds. And it was decided to produce a book which would outlive the exhibition and provide a resource which could be of use to scholars and the general public alike. And it's that book that you can see on sale in the museum shop here at the end of the exhibition. A very exciting moment came when it was decided to hold the exhibition in the round reading room at the centre of the British Museum. I don't know if any of you have visited this, but it's a historic building. And permission had to be sought from the London Borough of Camden, which is where the British Museum is located, because the reading room and the desks within it are listed as of historical significance. Many famous writers visited this library in the 19th and early 20th century, and it's in fact the library where Karl Marx came, and he wrote Das Kapital, sitting at one of the desks. So there's a certain irony in the situation. Anyway, Camden Council did grant permission in the end in the spring of 2007, and work began to build a temporary floor above the desks to create an exhibition venue of double the size of the previous temporary exhibition space. And this was in fact the first time an exhibition was held in this round reading room. It's now since then been followed by the Hadrian exhibition. And since the first Emperor exhibition featured the Great Wall of China, and the Hadrian exhibition featured Hadrian's Wall, there were quite a lot of jokes about going from wall to wall in the round reading room. The circular plan of the space and the vast oculus above presented quite a challenge to our designers. You can see here how we built the false floor on the top of the desks. On the left, you can see the desks have all been boxed in and this metal framework put on top. And then on the right, you can see the new floor that's been built on the top. And around the edge, you can see the, here, this is a sort of white screen all the way around the edge in front of the books, which are still actually there behind the screen. And that proved to be very useful. So we decided to split the exhibition into two halves. And the achievements of the first emperor were shown in the first half, and the second half presented the scale of the entire tomb complex and the emperor's grand vision, which was of nothing less than everlasting rule over the entire universe. Here you can see one of the slides of the British Museum exhibition after it had been installed. And the steps up to the false floor meant that the kneeling archer gradually appeared to the visitor as the first sight in the exhibition. Here. The round walls of the reading room were used to good effect, as we projected 2 large moving visual presentations on them. This is the part with the ancient bronzes in them, in the Warring States side. And this is the other side, the second half, with the, all the objects from the tomb complex. And what we did is that we projected 2 large moving visual presentations on the side, on the reading room walls, on the screen around the edge of the reading room wall. And the first half of the exhibition, there was a presentation about the Warring States and the way that the first emperor unified the country. And it's that presentation you can also see in your exhibition here. And in the second half, which represented the afterlife, the presentation was of gradually changing shots of vast numbers of warriors and aerial views of the tomb site, as well as a kind of virtual journey down into the pits containing the Terracotta army and into other pits. So these presentations told the story of the exhibition and reinforced the narrative presented on the printed labels and the information panels. It has to be said that installing this exhibition in the round reading room was not an easy task. Life-sized, fragile terracotta horses had to be hoisted up onto the false floor using a forklift truck, and many of the objects had to be transported into the room after opening hours, due to the situation of the reading room in the very centre of the British Museum, in the centre of the Norman Foster Great Court. And that's the busiest part of the museum. But I'm sure that the installation here has presented many challenges for the art handlers too, and the wonderful design and seamless production that you see now, probably underneath, you'll probably find there were all sorts of logistical problems that had to be solved. So the first emperor, before the discovery of the Terracotta Army in 1974, the first emperor's somewhat negative reputation in later times within China, I mean, he's been called a megalomaniac, he's been very negatively presented. It was to a large extent coloured by the Shiji. Now this is the Shiji, it's the Records of the Grand Historian, it's called in English. And it was written, it's a historical record that was written in 89 BC, which was about 100 years after the first emperor died. And it was written by a historian called Sima Qian. This is a woodblock print of him. But he was a Confucian, and he had his own agenda. He was actually castrated by the emperor under which he served. And he decided he would go on and finish the historical record. He could have decided to commit suicide because he'd been ashamed by being castrated. But anyway, he went on to write the historical record. But he was a Confucian, so it was written from a Confucian viewpoint, whereas the first emperor was not a Confucian in any shape or form, and he was what's called a legalist. Anyway, there were different philosophies, which is difficult to explain quickly, but basically the legalists believed in order of society, punishment and reward, and the Confucianists believed in leading by good example. Now, parts of this historical record, the Shiji, have been used in later times to emphasize the cruelty of the first emperor. There are, for example, records of the burning of the books, when the first emperor is meant to have burned all the books of Confucianism. And he's meant to have buried alive all the Confucian scholars. Well, we don't really know if this is true. There's not any evidence for it, and it's thought that these parts of the historical record were later additions. And in fact, the achievements of the first emperor were of huge significance. And this exhibition allows us to present a reassessment of this great ruler. The other thing about him is that we don't actually know what he looked like. We have no idea what he looked like. These pictures of him date from much later, from the 17th and 18th century, in fact, and they're totally made up. So you may see these pictures represented in books, reproduced in books of him, but we don't know that he looked like this at all. So there's no image of the first emperor in the exhibition. He was born in 259 BC, and he became king of the state of Qin in 246 BC, when he was only 13. But by the time he was 38, he'd unified the warring states. Because before this time, China was divided up into different states or kingdoms, which were at war with each other over various periods for hundreds of years. And here you can see the main states. And this dark brown one is the Qin state, and it was in the west of China. And the Qin was not the most developed of states. It was not the most culturally developed of states at all. Probably the Chu state down here was much more developed culturally. And the Qin people were originally horse breeders, and they gradually raised their status to that of duke and then of king. And they developed metalworking technology. This bell, for example, is an example of the metalworking technology of the Qin state before they unified China. And it has an inscription on it which says that the rulers of the Qin thought that they'd inherited the mandate to rule. And the Qin developed weapons technology. They were highly organized, and they developed weapons technology and military strategy. This is a sword from the Qin, and this is a crossbow trigger mechanism. High standards of quality control allowed the Qin to precisely cast weapons so that they were reliable, and when damaged, they could be replaced by standard parts. The crossbow trigger mechanism was actually not invented in the Qin state, but it was perfected in the Qin state. And this production of these standardized parts was a great step forward. And the trigger mechanism meant that you could shoot arrows from much greater distances, and that also transformed warfare. So this is the Qin, when they had unified China. What happened was that the Qin changed the legal, the political, the military, and the social institutions by making reforms that led to the foundation, laid the foundation for the state's rise to dominance. And by 221 BC, they'd succeeded in gradually conquering all the states, and the king of Qin declared himself Qin Shihuangdi, which means Qin first august divine emperor. So he took a new title for his new status. Now, in order to secure his newly unified empire, the first emperor ordered his general to complete construction of his Great Wall by joining together existing sections of wall built by the other states. This is a picture of the Qin Great Wall, which was made of tamped earth. Now, it's not the same as this, which you may be more familiar with, which is the Great Wall of China as we know it today. And that's faced with brick, and it was built much later in the Ming dynasty, in the 14th, 15th century. But some parts of the Qin Great Wall are on the same course as this Ming Great Wall. So you can say that the first Qin emperor did build the first Great Wall. He also built a major communications system consisting of a road and canal network, and even the width of the wheel axles was standardized in order to ensure that all carts traveled in the same ruts in the road. So the standardization was a very important part of this unification. The first emperor introduced a new law code with an emphasis on rewards and punishments. And he also presided over the standardization of weights and measures and the script. And here on the left you can see a weight which has a standardized weight and has an inscription on it telling us that he'd standardized the weights and measures. And that's of course very important if you're standardizing if you're unifying a whole area. And the script is another very important thing, because in China there are many different dialects. People can't really understand each other from one area to another, but the script is a unifying factor, and it was standardized at this time. And the first emperor adopted the small seal script, which is what this is. He also unified, standardized the different coinage systems of the previous warring states. Previous to this, each state had had a different type of coin. So one state would have a coin in the shape of a knife, like this. And another state would have a coin in the shape of a spade. Another one had this, which is called the ant nose coin, because it looks a bit like an ant nose. But what he introduced, this coin, the Banliang coin, which is a round coin with a square hole in the middle. He also built palaces in his capital. He set up a new capital in Xianyang, just near Xi'an, on the River Wei. And he built hundreds of palaces. And he built palaces which were laid out in his capital, reflecting the layout of the stars in the sky, because he thought of himself as a ruler of the entire universe, a ruler on a cosmic scale. And so the River Wei, which went through the middle of Xianyang, was like the Milky Way, and the palaces were laid out on either side of the river like the stars on either side of the Milky Way. He also travelled around the country he'd conquered, carrying out sacrifices on mountains. This is Mount Tai on the east of China. And he carried out sacrifices, and he set up inscriptions on stelae or stone tablets, proclaiming his achievements and declaring himself ruler of the entire universe. And this, which you can also see reproduced in the exhibition, is a rubbing of a stone inscription. And the stone inscription is actually one of the ones that was erected on Mount E, one of the mountains that he visited. But the inscription that we have today, which is in the museum in Xi'an, was written much later. It was carved out of stone much later in the 10th century AD, because the original one was lost. But the text is preserved. And part of it says, "Originally in times past he inherited the throne and was designated king. His might shook the four extremities. Martial order and rightness stood upright and straight. Now today the august divine emperor has unified all under heaven under one lineage. Benefits and blessings are lasting and enduring." So these inscriptions really declared his power and his achievements. But while declaring all this power, he was actually really fearful of conspiracy and of his own death. And in his search for immortality, he consumed many different potions made for him by alchemists at court. And he sent emissaries to the fabled islands of the immortals to search for magic herbs. He also started construction of his tomb. And this is his tomb mound, where he could rule in the afterlife for eternity. And from the time that he became king of the Qin state in 246 BC, construction on his tomb complex began. And when he became emperor in 221 BC, the design for his tomb was expanded. Large numbers of conscripts were used, as the military campaigns for unifying the empire had come to an end. Now his tomb complex was unfinished when he died suddenly in 210 BC. And we know that because when it was excavated, it was discovered that the Terracotta army pits, one of them was actually empty. So it's thought that when he died suddenly, they were all covered in when he was buried. So today, east of Xi'an, you can see this artificial hill, which is planted with bushes and trees, and it covers the tomb chamber of the first emperor, where he has lain undisturbed for 2,000 years. Now, although this tomb mound can be seen for a long distance, and it was well recorded, and the location of the tomb site was known because it was recorded in historical record, what came as a complete surprise was the discovery in 1974 of the Terracotta Army, because the Terracotta Army was not recorded. That historical record I told you about that was written, the Shiji, that was written by Sima Qian, he made absolutely no mention of the Terracotta Army. Now, the Terracotta Army is buried in 3 pits located to the east of the tomb. Located to the east of the tomb complex. And here you can see a plan of the complex. And you can see that the Terracotta Army pits are over here. There are 3 pits. And it's as if they were placed there to guard the tomb from attack from the east. This is the tomb mound itself with the tomb chamber inside with the emperor. And this is the walls around the edge of the tomb complex, 2 walls. And then this is the Terracotta army, and this is the east, north, south, west. The east is open to the Great Plains of China, whereas the north, the south, and the west, the tomb complex was sort of guarded by natural rivers and mountains. So it's as if it was there, it was lined up facing east, guarding the tomb from attack in the afterlife. All the warriors originally carried life-size real weapons, which disappeared when the pits were looted and burned in the rebellions after the death of the first emperor. It's perhaps the enormous scale of the Terracotta army, as well as the quality of the representation and manufacture of its members that continues to move visitors so greatly. These mature, life-size sculptures seem to have appeared out of nowhere, as there was no tradition of such large or such realistic sculptures in the centuries preceding the Qin. This is pit 1, with the Terracotta army lined up facing east. And this is the pit. When it was discovered, some of the warriors were in this sort of state, and they had to be stuck together again, conserved, and lined up in military formation. Because what had happened was that the pits were covered with wooden planks, and when they were looted and burned in the period after the first emperor's death, the burning caused the wood to fall in, the earth to fall in, and all the terracotta warriors fell in, and they were found in disarray. Now here are some of the figures that you can see in the exhibition and that have been excavated. And you can see some of the different types. These 2 are actually infantrymen. The one on the left is unarmoured and the one on the right has armour. But the interesting thing about them is the different faces. If you look at them, the one on the right has a very flat nose, Chinese-looking face. He looks like a typically Chinese man. And the one on the left has a big nose and a beard, and he's very hairy. And he looks more like a kind of Turkic type of person. Maybe he comes from the northwest, from the border regions. And so it's interesting that these 2 figures show the kind of ethnic makeup of China. Even today, you still have an ethnic mix. You have many different minority peoples in China. And I think this ethnic mix is reflected in the terracotta army. The soldiers were larger than life-size. They're very tall. And they were made with moulds and with coils, and then the details were finished off by hand. Here you can see some interesting differences in the trousers, the pants, as you would call them here. The one on the left, he has short trousers, and he can run around and be very, very quick. And the one on the right has armour over his shoulders and over his stomach. And if you compare that with these 2, the one on the right is a general, an armoured general, and he has a different sort of armour. You see his armour is different from the infantryman. His armour actually is made up of much smaller pieces. You see the infantryman on the right here. The pieces of armour are joined together, quite large pieces, and they would have been copying lacquered leather armour that would have been used in real life. But the general's armour is much smaller pieces, so probably it would have been easier, more flexible to wear. And it's pointed at the front, over his stomach, and it has this ribbons on it. And the reason we know it's a general is because here he has a general's hat, which is in the shape of a double-tailed bird, and it's tied under the chin, and that's a particular general's hat. He's also, if you look closely in the exhibition, got a hole under his left arm, which is probably for putting a sword scabbard in. He would have probably held a sword in his right hand because, of course, all these warriors had real life-size bronze weapons in their hands, but those were stolen when the pits, many of them were stolen when the pits were looted and burned. But many were also found in the pits, and the ones in the exhibition were excavated from the pits. And then the figure on the left here is an armoured officer. And he has different armour again and a different type of hat. And then here you can see a cavalryman and a cavalry horse. The cavalryman is quite tall and thin. He has a hard riding cap, and he has a scarf round his neck to stop the armour chafing against his neck. And his armour is actually sleeveless and very short. So it doesn't go down over his stomach, probably because then he could sit on his horse and it would be more comfortable because it stops at the waist and he could move his arms while sitting on the horse. He's also got quite a large, big nose. We know that the use of the cavalry was adopted from the northwest, from the nomads, so maybe he also came from that region. On the left, you can see the cavalry horse, which is very beautifully detailed. You can see, if you look in the exhibition, you can see better than here, the tail is intricately plaited and very beautiful. And the details of the saddle, the leather saddle done in clay, and all the details of the mane. The bridle is actually a stone bridle, and it's not the original, it's reproduced according to fragments that were found. Now this is actually a drain pipe on the right, and the reason I show that is because it's to do with how they were made. It's thought that maybe the people who made the drain pipes and the tiles and the roof tiles in the palaces of the first emperor were the same people who made the terracotta army. The same techniques were used to make the architectural ceramics as were used to make the terracotta army. We think that because some of the roof tiles that you can see in the exhibition have got inscriptions on them. They're stamped with the names of the workshops that made them. And the same names are stamped onto some of the terracotta army. So, and in fact, if you look at the legs of the terracotta army on the left, they look rather like the drain pipes. So it seems that the same techniques were used. In fact, although the warriors have been described by some as individual portraits in clay of actual soldiers, it's now been shown that the manufacture of the army was a great and early feat of mass production. A small and quite limited repertoire of body parts was produced, using moulds and coiling and slab building. And they were joined together in a multitude of combinations, with details worked by hand afterwards, before the whole figure was painted. Here you can see a model made in 1983, and the reproduction of that model is in the exhibition. And we included it because we thought it was a very good illustration of the production process, the mass production. Here you can see the building of one warrior who's being built from the bottom upwards and having his head being put on the top, pre-moulded head, and then taken off to be fired, after which they were painted. They were covered in lacquer and painted. But what happened was that each one was worked by hand. So although the heads were moulded, and there were a certain number of moulds and shapes for heads, and they were joined together behind the ears, in fact, each one was finished off by hand, so each one was actually slightly different. So there's endless variety of costumes and hairstyles and hand positions or facial features, but they weren't actually individual portraits. It's been estimated that over 1,000 people may have been involved in the making of the terracotta army. Here you can see pictures of some of the different hairstyles, and these are the backs of some of the figures you can see in the exhibition, and different kind of plaits and braids of the hair. And the different hats. The hat on the right is actually the one on the armoured infantryman, and it's a soft cap, which is on top of a top knot. And the soft cap has got this cord here, which means that it's like a drawstring, and you can tighten it to fit. The fact that there's no written description of this terracotta army in later historical records suggests that maybe it was kept secret on purpose. Many of the labourers probably died of overwork, and there are, in fact, some of the pits are tombs of the workers who made the terracotta army. Now, the warriors were originally brightly painted, and here on the right you can see some reconstructions of what they would have looked like originally when they were brightly coloured. It's quite a surprise to think that that is originally what they would have looked like, because now we see them terracotta coloured, but rather like the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon sculptures in the British Museum. They were also brightly coloured, but we think of them as white. We think of the terracotta army as terracotta coloured, but in fact originally they were brightly coloured. But what happened was that the colour pigments were mixed with lacquer. And when excavated, the exposure to air resulted in immediate loss of the colours. But over the last 15 years, conservation work has been done in cooperation with the German government and conservators, and it's resulted in new techniques being used to preserve some of the colours, which are surprisingly varied and bright. And on the left you can see a kneeling archer, which you can also see in the exhibition, which has been excavated and which has colour pigment. One figure has even been found with green on the face. In fact, I think it might be this one. And why it would have had a green face, I don't know. Maybe for scaring off evil spirits. But they've managed to preserve green and blue and red pigments on some of these figures, which is very exciting. And they're the ones that have been excavated more recently. So the ones you see in the exhibition, the kneeling archers, have been excavated much more recently. If you look at the dates of excavation, I think they were 2001 or 2002. So since the discovery of the terracotta army, ongoing excavations have furthered our knowledge of the massive scale of the entire tomb complex. The first emperor's tomb complex is in fact an ideal model of the realm over which he had ruled and over which he intended to continue to rule after his death. Remains of above-ground buildings have been found within the large tomb area up here. And it was surrounded by two walls, the inner wall and the outer wall. And the entire tomb complex covers an area of 50 square kilometres, and they've discovered over 500 subsidiary pits and tombs in this area. And they're still excavating it today. You see the terracotta army was discovered here, and the other things in the exhibition were found in different locations around here and around the edge of the tomb mound. And this is the tomb mound where the emperor is still buried. In 1972, before the discovery of the terracotta army, some of these figures were found, and these were originally thought, they were just found random figures over the and they were thought to be women. They're very small. There's one in the exhibition. But in fact, eventually they discovered that they were in a pit to the southeast of the tomb mound, and it was a stable pit. It was like an imperial stables for the afterlife, and there were real horse skeletons and real hay for the horses, and these terracotta figures in the pits together with the horses. And so they're known that they were stable boys, and they've actually found some with moustaches on them. But what happened was, in 1974, there was a peasant digging a well, and in a long hot summer, and he was digging this well, and he discovered this terracotta head, and he dug it up and informed the authorities, and eventually they started digging, and it was found that he'd inadvertently hit the corner of pit number 1, and it was after that that the authorities started digging, and they realised the actual huge scale of this tomb complex, because the terracotta warrior pits are 1.5 kilometres to the east of the actual tomb mound. And then as they dug, they found more and more interesting things. And that's really, the story of that can be seen in the exhibition. So here you can see where all the other pits were, where they found the things in the exhibition. So you'll be able to see 2 bronze chariots, which were found here, the bronze chariots pit. You'll be able to see stone armour, which was found here, acrobats, which were found here, bureaucrats or officials, which were found here, and more horse stables that were found here. And then actually the bronze birds were found right up here, probably about up there, miles away. So they're still excavating. That's what's so exciting about this exhibition, that it tells you what's going on now. So the chariots were found in 1980. So they started digging, and they found in 1980 these two magnificent painted bronze chariots just west of the tomb mound. And the pit in which they were found were joined to the tomb mound by an underground passageway, suggesting that they were for taking the first emperor on inspection tours in the afterlife. And they were very thin, half-life-size bronze. And here you can see the two of them. And this is chariot number 1, which is thought to be a sort of military chariot. Well, anyway, it's got a figure. It's got in the back. It's got a shield and a quiver for arrows. And this is chariot number 2, which is sometimes called the comfortable chariot, maybe for the emperor to recline in. And it has a little window with crisscross hatching in it for sort of air circulation. And it's painted in white with a cloudy pattern, suggesting the heavens. And then, more recently, in the 1990s, what's been discovered is an intriguing find of hundreds of sets of grey stone armour in the late 1990s. They were discovered in a large rectangular pit to the south of the tomb mound, over 13,000 square metres in size. And it includes horse armour as well as sets of armour for people. And it's puzzled scholars because, although this armour is carefully modelled on the leather and iron suits used in battle at this time, armour in stone is much too heavy to be practical. I mean, you couldn't possibly wear it in real life. It would have been useless protection against spearheads and arrows of bronze and iron. It's thought that it would have just shattered. So it must be some sort of armour for the afterlife, for some kind of spirit army. So it's a kind of armoury for the afterlife, made of stone. And the amount of time taken to make these hundreds and hundreds of sets of human and horse armour is incredible. Each little piece is drilled with holes and beveled edges, and fantastic amount of work. These have been reconstructed. When the pit was found, they were all just laying in the ground because each one of them had been on a kind of wooden stand, a bit like a kind of clothes stand. And the wood had all disintegrated, and so all the bits of armour were just on the floor. And the German conservators have worked together with the Chinese to conserve this stone armour. And China's also famous for inventing bureaucracy, so it's appropriate that the first emperor felt the need for officials, bureaucrats, in his afterlife, as well as an army to guard him. And in late 2000, a group of terracotta bureaucrats or civil officials and scribes came to light in a pit to the southwest of the tomb mound. And they're identified as officials or bureaucrats because of the knife and the sharpener hanging from their belts. Also from their official hats, which you can see here, tied under the chin, and they reproduce in clay a kind of gauze hat which would have been stiffened with lacquer. And here you can see their long sleeves, their hands are folded inside their long sleeves. They covered up their hands as if to say they don't want to dirty their hands, they don't want to do manual labour, so we know they're bureaucrats. They've got rather a haughty expression on their face, and they have these knives and knife sharpeners. You can see the pink pigment on this one. Some of the pigments remain because these also have been dug up in 2000, so they've been able to conserve some of the colours. But here you can see a detail of the knife and the knife sharpener on the left, which is reproduced in terracotta, hanging on the belt of the official. And on the right you can see the real bronze knife and the real stone knife sharpener, which you can also see in the exhibition. And this was because the stone was used for sharpening the knife, and the knife was used for erasing mistakes on the wood or the bamboo strips, which were used for writing on before the invention of paper. And they were all rolled up together into scrolls. And then entertainment was also provided for the emperor in his afterlife. Here you can see a pit to the southeast of the tomb mound, where they found 11 terracotta acrobats and strongmen with a large bronze tripod on the top. And if you look carefully in the top left here, this figure, in pieces. And then you look at this one, you can see that's him joined together. It's a big, strong man who would have been in some kind of acrobatic or strongman troupe. And he's got very developed muscles in his arms and his legs, huge, great feet, and a big belly. And he's got no head, unfortunately, but he's got an amazing body, so you just admire the body. His left arm is kind of like this, and it's formed around a hole here, and it seems as if there might have been a pole, a wooden pole stuck in here, maybe for supporting another acrobat, or maybe he was lifting the pole. And he seems to have a kind of leather, if you look carefully in the exhibition, he seems to be holding a kind of leather belt or something in his hand, so maybe that was for supporting something or someone. Other acrobats that were found in the pit, like this. This is an example of another acrobat found in the same pit, and he is probably spinning something on his finger, and he's standing on one leg, finishing a trick. So entertainment for the afterlife. And then the most recent find was in August 2001, and that was of an F-shaped pit right up to the northeast of the tomb mound, outside the two walls of the complex. And this F-shaped pit included a diverted underground river containing terracotta musicians, terracotta figures anyway, and bronze birds. The terracotta musicians were found in these little niches along here, and along the top was the diverted river, in which were life-size bronze cranes and swans and geese. Now we don't know exactly what this represents, but one theory is that it's a sort of afterlife wildlife park, and that the bronze water birds were actually dancing to music played by these terracotta figures who were thought to be musicians. And the terracotta figures, this is one of the bronze birds. This is a swan, beautifully made swan, and they were actually painted in white with feathery details on them. And this is a crane, which is also in the exhibition, and you can see in its mouth, in its beak, it's catching a worm or a fish or something. And these bronze cranes and swans were found together with these figures, and these are thought to be musicians, and it's thought that the one on the left may be playing some kind of plucking a stringed instrument, and the one on the right may be banging a percussion instrument. But then other people think, maybe he's rowing a boat, or maybe he's fishing. Who knows? But the Chinese archaeologist who excavated this pit, Duan Qingbo, he has written in the catalogue, and his thesis is that they're musicians, and that the bronze birds are birds that are trained to dance to the musicians' music to entertain the emperor in the afterlife, which is rather a magical thought. Now, this is the actual tomb mound as it is today. The Shiji, the historical record, it describes what may be in the tomb mound. It says, when the emperor first came to the throne, he began digging and shaping Mount Li, and later, when he unified the empire, he had over 700,000 men from all over the empire transported to the spot. They dug down to the third layer of underground springs and poured in bronze to make the outer coffin. Palaces, scenic towers, the 100 officials, as well as rare utensils and wonderful objects, were brought to fill up the tomb. Craftsmen were ordered to set up crossbows and arrows, rigged so that they would immediately shoot down anyone attempting to break in. Mercury was used to fashion the 100 rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, and the seas in such a way that they flowed. Above were set the heavenly bodies, below the features of the earth. Whale oil was used for lamps, which were calculated to burn for a long time without going out. Well, this is what it says in the historical record, but this tomb mound itself has never been excavated. Chinese archaeologists have decided not to excavate the actual tomb chamber, but they're concentrating on those many pits surrounding it, which I showed you, and which is represented in the exhibition. They're awaiting future developments in excavation and conservation techniques, as well as new ways of non-destructive scanning. And this quote is from Wu Yongqi, the director of the Terracotta Army Museum, who was here last night for the gala. He says he hopes that they will develop non-destructive techniques so that they never need disturb the first emperor. And I think it may be that they don't excavate the tomb, who knows. I think they're right to be cautious because, for example, the development in the techniques for preserving the pigments, the colours on the terracotta figures, show that it's better to leave things in the ground until such time as you can cope with what you might find. But as excavation proceeds in the areas around the tomb mound, all the pits, the grand scale of the first emperor's underground government and the scale of his underground empire where he could rule forever is gradually revealed. So, in conclusion, despite the first emperor's somewhat negative reputation in later times within China, archaeology has shown that his achievements were of huge significance, and he was one of the world's greatest leaders. He can be compared with Napoleon or Alexander the Great. And he's somebody that we in the West ought to know more about. He founded a dynasty based on law and order and egalitarianism. Many of the changes he initiated were adopted by the following Long Han dynasty and all the dynasties after that until the last emperor in 1911. And he established a meritocracy, a centralized bureaucracy, and a monetary union. And many of these things lasted all throughout Chinese history. And this is an example because on the top left you can see the Banliang coin of the first emperor, the round coin with the square hole in. And on the right you can see the coin of the last emperor in 1911, which is a round coin with a square hole in. And here you can see the logo of the Bank of China today, which is a round coin with a square hole in it. So it shows the legacy of the first emperor today. And he established a single script, which was to last throughout all the succeeding dynasties and be a great unifying factor in China. The first emperor was also used in political campaigns in the 20th century, particularly by Mao Zedong. But this exhibition aims to present a balanced view of him using primary evidence in the hope that the first emperor will become much better known and understood in the Western world. And I hope that in understanding the first emperor and that important changing point in Chinese history, we may all come to understand present-day China a bit better. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer a few questions if anybody has any.
It's just a real quick question. I was wondering how much the terracotta warriors weigh.
Oh, wow. I'm not entirely sure, to be quite honest. But I know that in the exhibition, the heaviest item in the exhibition was the bronze chariots, because with the round reading room and our building of the false floor, we had quite a complex discussions about the weight loading, and that was the heaviest part. I mean, of course, all the weights were recorded for the transportation. The transportation of them was quite tricky, had to be divided up into several planes, and each one was put in a crate, sort of strapped into a crate, slid into it, a bit like a coffin or something, and each horse was transported in a kind of harness. I don't know the exact weight of each one, but they are hollow inside, of course, and the horses, you'll see, when you go into the exhibition, you'll see a hole in the horse, and that's a firing hole, so that it wouldn't explode in the kiln. 400 pounds, okay, you'll know because of the packing. Okay.
You always see the pictures where you have the warriors and there's earth between them. Mm-hmm. What's in the earth?
Well, the warriors were in this pit number 1, and they were lined up in rows, and there's a kind of mound of earth to make columns and like walls within the pit to divide it up so that the roof of the pit, which was made of wooden planks, would rest on each row of walls. So, but the the wooden planks have all disappeared because they fell in. So all you see is the remains of all the sort of tamped earth walls in between.
I have a question.
Yes.
As the Egyptian tombs were excavated and we have examples of the mummies, are the Chinese going to excavate the tomb?
Well, at the moment there's been a decision not to excavate the tomb. There has been a ruling that no imperial tomb chamber should be excavated. They did actually excavate one or two emperors' tombs earlier on. There's a very famous tomb of the Ming Emperor Wan Li, which you may have seen at the Ming tombs outside Beijing, where you can actually walk into the tomb chamber. That's a 16th century tomb. But they've now decided that no emperor's tomb chamber should be excavated. In this particular case, the first emperor is probably the most important tomb in China, and he is kind of their ancestor, you know, the ancestor of the Chinese. So there is this great reverence for ancestors. It may be I think they're not going to excavate it in our lifetime, is what I would say. And partly because of this reason of sort of superstition or respect, you know, for the first emperor, but partly for the reason that they want to develop more scientific and conservation techniques so that they might be able to preserve what they might find if they did dig it. Because there'd be nothing worse than things just disintegrating as soon as they found them. And as I said, the experience they've had with the colours on the terracotta figures shows that actually developing conservation techniques first is a good idea.
Thanks so much, Jane, for a most enjoyable lecture, and hope everybody gets to visit the exhibition soon. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.